Perfect.
Merci tout le monde d'être là. Bonjour,
So
bonjour
thank you
Bensahli.
everyone for being here.
Avant de commencer, avant de me présenter ou de présenter qui que ce soit,
Just
j'aimerais juste
before
commencer
starting,
par reconnaître que la nation Gani-Guéhaga, comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous
I just want
réunissons
to
aujourd'hui,
recognize that the
vous le savez,
Ganyegahaga
est historiquement
Nation
connue comme un lieu de
are
rassemblement pour
the
de nombreuses
uh,
Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone
is the guardian
diversifiée,
of
ainsi que
the
d'autres groupes
lands and
invisibles.
waters on which
Donc,
we
c'est dans le
are
respect du lien
here
avec le
today.
passé, le présent et
Njojage is
l'avenir
historically
que nous
known
reconnaissons
as
et
a
nous avons
meeting
énormément
place
de
for
travail à
many
faire
First
sur les relations
Nations.
avec les peuples
And
autochtones
today,
et nous en
it's an
sommes
indigenous,
conscients.
diversified
Il nous semble
indigenous
important de
population,
reconnaître
along
l'état de
with
nos
many other
connaissances et nos
people
pratiques
live
décoloniales
here.
et on voudrait aussi que ces
And it's
connaissances soient
just
intégrées dans
in
notre travail en
respect
racisme.
for our links with the
Donc,
past, the
dites-vous que
present, and the
contrairement
future
à
that we
cette
recognize that
conversation
we have
authentique
a
sur un
lot of
sujet
work to do
très
on
essentiel et très
relationships
urgent,
with Indigenous people,
soit
and
la santé
we're
des femmes
aware
dans
of
les zones de
that.
conflit,
It's very
respecter le
important
droit
for us to
défendu
be
pour les femmes
honest
vivant avec une
about
maladie
the state of
chronique.
our knowledge and
Donc, on est
decolonial
réunis aujourd'hui
practices.
pour aborder
And
des
we really
questions qui
want
touchent
this work to
au
be
cœur même de la
an
santé
integral
humaine
part
et de la justice
of
sociale dans le
Breast
contexte
Cancer
de
Action
guerre, de
Quebec.
déplacements forcés, de
So,
catastrophes
welcome to
climatiques
this authentic
et d'un traitement
conversation
vulnérable.
on
Et
a
pourtant,
subject that is
l'endroit,
as
l'objectif
essential
primordial
as
de
it
leurs
is
besoins
urgent.
spécifiques en matière de
The
santé
health of
reste
women in
largement
conflict
ignoré
zones,
dans les réponses aux
decolonial
gouvernements.
perspectives,
Cette
and issues
invisibilité
for
devient
women with chronic
d'autant plus critique
illnesses.
lorsqu'elles vivent avec des
So, we're
maladies
here
chroniques
today to
comme le
talk
cancer
about
du
these
sein.
questions,
Aujourd'hui,
which
nous avons avec nous des experts
really get to the
du secteur
heart
scientifique,
of
une personne
human
militante,
dignity
une
and
chercheuse
social
non seulement
justice in
à la
a
lutte contre
context of
les guerres et les
war,
déplacements sur la
forced
santé des femmes,
displacement, and
mais
climate
aussi explorer des
crisis.
pistes
Women are
concrètes
also often the
nourries de
most
perspectives
vulnerable,
décoloniales
and yet
pour
their
transformer ce
voices, their
système d'oppression et
experiences,
offrir des
and their
réponses qui respectent
specific
la diversité des vécus.
needs in health
Donc,
issues
pour
are often
commencer, je vais
ignored
introduire
in
nos
global
panélistes.
humanitarian responses. So, this
Je vais
invisibility
partager le...
becomes even more critical when they
Merci à
have
vous.
chronic illnesses such as breast cancer. So, we have several
Ah bon.
experts with us today in
Donc,
public
tout
health,
d'abord, moi, je me présente. Je
activists,
m'appelle Amira Bensahli.
researchers,
Je suis
not
vice-présidente du
only
Conseil
to
d'administration du
analyze the
Centre Action
impacts of
Cancer du
these
sein. Je
wars
suis
and displacements
cofondatrice
on
du Centre
women's
de
health,
femmes
but
capables
also
du
to look
collège.
at
Et parallèlement, je termine
concrete
maîtrise en sociologie. Merci,
ways that we
excusez-moi,
can
j'en fais trop.
work
Donc,
on decolonial perspectives to
conclusion
transform these systems of
d'ajouter que
oppression
c'est
and offer
important qu'on ait la
responses
conversation
which
dans une
respect the
perspective intersectionnelle pour
diversity
ramener
of
différence qui fait que
experiences.
des fois, on ne pense pas
So,
nécessairement
my
intersect ou
name
nuancé
is Amira
le son du chacun.
Bensahli,
Donc, on a aussi Marie Atem, qui est professeure titulaire à l'École de santé publique
and
de l'Université de Montréal.
one of our
Elle
guests
dit
today
Notre
is Marie
savoir
Atem,
est
who's
IGA,
from
soutenir
the Public
l'autonomisation
Health
des femmes
School
francophones
at
en
the
santé,
University of
directrice de
Montreal.
l'International Center for Advanced Research and Training et
And
fondation Haïti.
she is the
Elle est aussi
director
responsable
of
du
the
programme de
Hygia Observatory,
popularisation du
supporting the
renforcement de
empowerment
la
of
recherche en
Francophone
santé des
women in
femmes
health,
en ces
the
thématiques
director of the
accessibles. Et on
International
souhaite
Center for
aujourd'hui
Advanced Research
la
and
représentative du
Training,
Congo, justement.
the Panzi Foundation, and she works for the
Bon, ça va
BRE
bien?
Fellowship Program to
Oui,
strengthen
merci.
women's
Oui,
health
je suis avocate de
research.
Bukavu, du Sud Kivu.
Ouais. Ensuite, nous avons Zahia El-Masri, qui est militante pour la justice sociale. Donc, elle est née comme réfugiée
We also have
palestinienne au Liban.
Zaya El
Elle
Masri,
détient une
who
maîtrise en
is
Sciences
an
Po et un
activist
diplôme de haute
for
études en
social
théologie, éthique et
justice.
religion.
She was born
Elle a
in
travaillé près
Lebanon
de
as a
12 ans dans le
Palestinian
logement social
refugee.
et
She holds a
l'intégration des
master's
migrants.
degree in
C'est une
political
militante féministe
science
de longue date,
and a
une personne
diploma
passionnée de la
in
justice sociale.
theology, ethics, and
Elle est une
religions.
formatrice très appréciée et
She's worked for
conférencière de
almost
chef
12
auprès des
years in
organismes
social
communautaires,
housing
d'institutions
and
publiques, de diverses ONG, de groupes de défense de
the
droits, tant sur les droits des
in
Palestiniens que des
newcomers.
approches et pratiques
She's a
interculturelles.
longtime feminist
C'est
activist
aussi
and a
la
passionate
fondatrice du
advocate
collectif
for social
des Femmes pour la
justice.
Palestine
She's
et
much
membre fondateur du
appreciated as a
collectif La
trainer,
Palestine.
and
Bonjour
she's a
Zahia.
sought after
Comment tu
speaker
vas?
to
Bonjour,
community
merci pour
organizations,
l'invitation.
Merci
academic
d'être là avec nous.
institutions, various
Ensuite, on a Alana,
NGOs, and
Marie-Hélène
advocacy
Casseux,
groups. How are you
qui
today,
est
Zaya?
une avocate guayano-barbadienne
Finally, we have
spécialisée dans
Alana.
l'environnement, l'énergie
who
et
is
les
a
droits de la personne,
Guyanese
ainsi qu'une
Barbadian
experte et
environmental,
spécialiste des
energy,
ressources
and human
naturelles.
rights lawyer,
Elle est
an
actuellement chargée de
academic,
cours
and a
en droit
natural
international de
resources
l'environnement et de
specialist.
l'énergie et chef des lignes
She's a
de
lecturer
l'environnement
in
des Caraïbes de
international
la faculté de
environmental
droit
and
de
energy law
l'Université des Indes
and head
occidentales,
of the
campus de
Caribbean
Québec.
Environmental Law
Malala est
Unit of
aussi
the
chercheuse au
Faculty
sein
of
du One
Law
Ocean
of
Hub,
the
qui est
University of
financé
the
par
West
le GCRF
Indies in the Cave Hill
et est directrice
campus.
régionale du Global Network
She's
for Human
also
Rights
a
and the
researcher with
Environment
the
pour la région des
UKRI
Caraïbes. Depuis
GCRF funded
2014, elle est
One
membre de la
Ocean
branche
Hub.
caribéenne
She
de la
serves as
situation
the
du droit
regional
international et
director of the
siège
Global
actuellement au
Network for
comité
Human
exécutif de
Rights
la
and the
branche.
Environment for the Caribbean region.
Bonjour Alana.
Since 2014, she's been a member of the International Law Association Caribbean branch, and she currently serves on the branch's executive. Hi, Elena. How are you
Good
today?
afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here.
Merci de nous rejoindre. Kathleen, je m'excuse si j'arrête pas de parler.
Thanks so much for being with us.
Force of habit. Donc, j'aimerais juste commencer par citer un article de Malini Ramgatan
I just want to start with a citation from Maligni Rangatan called The Environment as Freedom, a Decolonial Reimagining. She says, though not always framed explicitly in terms of the environment, radical understandings of freedom brought into focus some of the most challenging environmental injustices of the contemporary period: worker health, transit equity, urban segregation, rural and agrarian impoverishment, and land degradation, to name a few. Struggles for freedom also connected the dots between local struggles, which themselves were interlinked, and global formations of economic power, racism, and militarism.
Comme une analyse clé à travers laquelle imaginer notre avenir environnemental. By
building on Black radical, feminist, and decolonial lineage, I want to suggest that we reclaim freedom as a key analytic through which to imagine our environmental future. Centering anti-racist and intersectional perspectives in our understanding of the environment as freedom might allow us to expose historical causality and the entangled nature of oppression. Ultimately, it might enable us to forge a broad-based counter-narrative for tackling environmental unfreedoms. And Amira is happy to share the link to that article with you if you're interested. So as Breast Cancer Action Quebec is a feminist organization dedicated to the prevention and to environmental justice, we're engaged in putting women's health at the heart of debates, including in more difficult contexts. Wars and humanitarian crises really exacerbate the inequalities between genders, and they multiply the obstacles for those who live with illnesses like breast cancer. And as health systems are really struggling, it's more difficult to access healthcare, and environmental precarity, which is often ignored, is becoming a silent menace that's not going away. As an engaged movement, we have to refuse to sit back and watch this reality. So today, we want to not only reflect, but also act. We really want to recognize that medical approaches and traditional policies are not sufficient. A decolonial perspective, which is centered on local knowledge and the lived experiences of women, is essential to respond to humanitarian crises today. Together with our panelists and all of you who are listening to us today, we're going to look at new approaches, collaborative approaches, which put women at the center of solutions in all their diversity. As activists for climate justice, refugee rights, and the prevention of chronic illnesses, We need to continue organizing, creating alliances, and ensuring that we get responses that take into account the reality of women in conflict zones. So the first question is, how do war contexts and force displacement impact women's health, especially concerning illnesses such as breast cancer? And what are the intersection with climate crises? And Zaya is talking about Palestinian women particularly. She wants to talk about not only Gaza, but also occupied territories. In Gaza, the forced displacement means that women cannot access cancer treatments. And even if they have permission to leave, it is impossible for them to actually leave, even if they have medical appointments. Already, it's very difficult to have access to specialists. And so it's not only just the women who are being displaced, but their entire families who are being displaced as well. And so they have no access to hygienic living situations. Their nutrition is lacking, and that's affecting everyone. And so the same thing is happening in other occupied territories where women are losing access to the specialists that they worked so hard to find. In the case of Palestine, we're talking about poverty that is being imposed on these women in a systemic way. Marie? Thank you so much for inviting me today, for giving me the chance to be with you this evening. I just want to share some of my experiences with you. I'm from Lebanon, so we're very aware of what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Lebanon. And recently I've met people from Turkey, from the Ukraine, who also talk about the women's suffering sexual violence, which is used as a weapon of war, and all the problems related to that. So how can war have an impact on women's health? Obviously, there's the direct impact when you're being shot at. That's obviously traumatic, and you end up being not only physically wounded, but also mentally affected. But there's also the destruction of elements which are essential to life: food, clean water, medication. So all of that, women are the first, and children, other minors are the first to suffer the consequences. And it's very difficult for them to be in contact with people who can provide healthcare services to them. And if you have any kind of chronic illness, diabetes, this is even more complex. People are not able to get diagnoses because they're not able to get to anywhere where they could receive these diagnoses. So getting a diagnosis is essentially impossible, which makes health issues even more complex. So my contacts in who work in breast cancer, they are saying they don't have the ability to diagnose cases of breast cancer. And obviously, the treatment as well is very difficult to perform in a war zone.
Alana va plus être experte en questions décoloniales. Donc,
So, Alana, you're here more to talk about the decolonial questions.
On a mis les bases un petit peu sur c'est quoi les enjeux. On va passer un peu plus à la question
So,
de en quoi
we'll go to the next question.
dans la gestion de la santé des
How is a decolonial approach for managing women's health? How can that help respond to humanitarian crises in
Thank you
conflict
for
zones
having
and
me.
for refugees?
I
Alana,
think
if you'd like to
the
start.
first place to start is that overwhelmingly, we are existing in an environment where there is a more colonial approach, or events which are catalyzed by colonial approaches, which then exacerbates issues for women. So my perspective is from the climate, that of climate justice, and essentially this shares a lot of the challenges and atrocities which women would find themselves in conflict zones. So in many parts of the world, and usually these are parts of the world which are more vulnerable, uh, uh primarily because of colonial events. There are climate-related impacts such as more frequent storms, droughts, and so on, which essentially lead to climate migration. So essentially, women in these instances find themselves not only unable to access physical care, but also mental care. And added to this, because women are usually we focus on women, but in general, especially in the global South, women are usually, well, there's been an increase in single female households, one, but also women are very important to aspects such as food and nutrition security and so on for their families. So this has corresponding impacts not only for women, but children. Now, I think one of the challenges in the climate justice sphere, and I suspect in the health sphere, is that even though we know that or many feminist groups and would have identified the challenges to women, this has not found its way into decision making in terms of disaster risk management, healthcare, and so on, and indeed recognizing women's rights, or aspects of women's rights, such as their right to health, so specifically to the breast cancer, which are impacted, and how this right needs to feature in decision making. While we have a long way to go, I think the increased recognition of globally of many rights, including the right to a healthy environment, have begun the process, and in many discourses, including the climate discourse, there's increased need to include women in decision making. we see in many international instruments which promote inclusion of women in decision making, as well as to address historic areas of inequality that impact women. And one I will give quickly is that of tenure. So in many areas, the inequalities in tenure often translate into impacts on women's livelihood, and therefore their ability to access healthcare, and as well as also the impacts on transferring cultural and other forms of knowledge to their children, especially female children, who can then be caught up in these cycles. We have the development of along with the human rights, of many instruments which are aimed at addressing this, and the challenge is getting these implemented nationally, and the recognition and increased involvement in international processes. And one of the things I'd like to finish off by saying is that even though we say women, and as an entirety, women and girls are adversely impacted by both wars and climate change for similar and different reasons, we also need to disaggregate the fact that some women are more vulnerable than others. So, for example, Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, disabled women, and also there are geographic aspects to these inequalities, which again we need to, which again are steeped in colonial approaches, and increasingly will need the colonial efforts to bring some equity. I think I can pause there.
Zélia, est-ce que tu voulais rajouter quelque chose?
Oui, absolument. L'approche décoloniale.
Zaya, Marie, did you want to add anything?
Quand on parle de la Palestine, parce que
So when we're talking about Palestine, we always need to put what's happening in context. Because everyone talks about October 7th, but Palestinian history goes way before October 7th. There's 1948. There's everything that's happened in the past few decades. So we have to consider that as well, and consider that in Palestine, there's a new term. We've already heard about apartheid, and people who are saying we are living in apartheid in Palestine. We need to think about Israel's public policy as well, that we've been talking about for decades, and it's women's groups who are talking about this, the issues that the situation in Palestine has on their health, because the public system is offering different treatment to Palestinian women than it is offering to Israeli women. So there's really a sense of medical apartheid that's happening. And the doctors who came up with this term have said that this is what is happening in Palestine. So a decolonial approach is really essential when we talk about women's health in conflict zones, because what's happening in Palestine is colonization, and we have to live with the consequences of that colonization. And Marie says the problem with the management of women's health, when we talk about health in conflict zones, The representation is often coming from Western countries, and all of the a lot of the work to support women in conflict zones is really developed by Westerners from a Western perspective. And so the interventions haven't changed. There's a very paternalistic approach that's being used. And so what we recommend for decolonial approaches is to deconstruct what's been happening already that has its Western roots. And so this is a process, a deconstruction process. And we can't think about it in a binary colonial versus decolonial. And because obviously imperialism has a very consumerist approach. And so it's really a very capitalistic approach that we're seeing. We really want to have a vision that comes from the populations who are being affected directly, a universal approach, a post-colonial approach. And we really need to look at the experiences of the people who are being displaced. And so if we think about the image of an iceberg, you only see the very top of the iceberg. You only see a very little bit of the problem, but there's many more problems if you go beneath the surface of the water. So we have to think about not only the event, the displacement, but also everything that happened around that displacement, around that traumatic event. And so we really need to also look at the beliefs, the values of the people who are being affected by these events. We really need to look at the whole picture, not just the event itself, and deconstruct the way that these interventions have been done in the past. So if we take a post-colonial approach, it's often distrusted. And if we're talking about breast cancer in particular, we need to know how women are perceiving this experience of breast cancer or another chronic illness. Cancers can often become secondary to everything else that's going on. It might not be the main issue. And so doctors who are working with populations who have been displaced don't often take the time to really listen to the experiences of the people they are diagnosing. And so that means that they're not really helping the situation because the people affected are not being listened to. And meanwhile, these women are continuing to fight, they're continuing to work, even if they're not receiving treatment for their cancer. So that's what I can say with regards to decolonialization. Thank you, Marie. That's really interesting. We really need to think about how to center the lives and experiences of the first people concerned, in this case, the women.
C'est quelque chose qui est comme passager ou quoi que ce soit, mais de réaliser qu'en fait, il y a
We need to realize
non seulement par la personne,
that
leur famille,
there are lives being impacted not only by the women themselves, for the women themselves, but also for their families. And so we have to think about their traditions, their own approaches, and what they're fighting for as well. But we can't reflect on how best to treat these women without their own input. Alana, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think I also want to add that one of the aspects that is not often discussed because it is the also the mental aspect or the mental health of women, and many of the not only you know, in the context of breast cancer, the support that one would usually have in non-conflict situations or non-transient situations may not, most likely will not be there, but they're also the mental health support that the circumstances of displacement and conflict and so exacerbate. And I think it often, I don't want to say disproportionately impacts women, but often because they are higher risk, this also is an element which needs to be also factored in, and is often even in normal circumstances. And again, I'm speaking from my experience in like the Caribbean and so on. Mental health is something that I tell many people it is one of the positives that came from COVID, that people speak about their mental health more, because it's not something in, at least in our part of the world, that we converse, but it's very much intertwined with a lot of these with a lot of these issues. And I think some of the reluctance to address it is also tied up in coloniality. So that needs to be deconstructed. Sorry, I need to remember. You need to translate. Sorry.
No worries, I'm taking notes.
Oh.
Donc oui, ben, c'est ça, Alana voulait rajouter aussi la
So
question du
Amira
support
is
en santé
just
mentale.
translating what
Le
Alana
support que
just
t'as
said.
normalement quand t'es pas dans une zone de conflit, quand tu vis une maladie comme le cancer.
Amira, si je me permets de rajouter juste sur ce point.
I just wanted to add something on this.
Je me permets de vous appeler Marie, d'accord? Avec votre
I'll, Marie, can I call you by your
on
first name?
parle de santé mentale,
I just wanted to talk about how mental health is often a taboo subject among Palestinian women, Palestinians. And I just wanted to let you know that something I discovered in my research is that there is a very small mental health unit in the healthcare department at the Ramallah University. And there's this taboo, despite the fact that there is intergenerational trauma that Palestinians have experienced by being displaced. Their grandparents, great grandparents were displaced. And in Gaza, the majority of patients who are trying to get out are not accompanied. And so if they're trying to leave Gaza to get treatment for chemotherapy, radiation therapy, they can only go by themselves. They can't be accompanied by a family member or a friend. So this idea of being accompanied for your mental health is completely absent because the priority is just
Puis on sait que ça a un impact sur la santé physique
going
aussi,
for your
absolument.
treatment. And so that has a big
Je peux
impact as well.
renchérir là-dessus?
Oui.
Can I add something?
Ben, pour renchérir, je vais vous parler de
Just to
l'expérience
add,
du modèle dans lequel je suis actuellement. Donc, quand j'étais à Bukavu,
I just wanted to
je suis
talk
directrice du
about
centre de
the
recherche
model that
de la
I'm
Fondation
working in
Panzi, une fondation qui a
currently.
été créée par le prix Nobel de la paix, Denis Mukwege,
I'm
pour
the
aider et
director
soutenir les
of
femmes victimes de
a
violences durant la
foundation
guerre comme
which
arme de
was
guerre.
really
Donc, ils
created
ont commencé
to
depuis une quinzaine
help
d'années. Et puis,
women
on avait commencé
who were
par
emerging
la
from war
chirurgie, le
situations.
traitement physique
And if we talk about
de toutes les
surgery,
déchirures
the
et
physical
problèmes que les femmes
treatment,
pouvaient avoir après des violences de guerre.
and
Mais une fois traitées,
um,
les femmes ne voulaient plus rentrer, elles n'avaient pas nulle part où aller.
if we talk
Elles étaient
about
stigmatisées, humiliées, maltraitées, anxieuses,
the
choc
effects of
post-traumatique, il y a
sexual
tout le
violence that it
post-traumatique. Donc,
has
ils
on
ne savaient
their
plus quoi faire pour
bodies.
les aider. Ils ont
We
créé
found that
le
once the
pilier
physical treatment
psychosocial.
was
Et après, il
over,
fallait leur
these
donner
women
la
did not
possibilité de
want
se
to
prendre en main.
talk
On
about
a
their
créé un pilier
experiences
socio-économique pour les
as
aider à avoir
well.
un emploi et s'en sortir. Et par la suite,
And
là, on parle de
so
réparation
we
et
created
au
a
niveau légal. Donc, un modèle dans
socioeconomic
lequel on
context
baigne
where they
aussi
can
pour
find
soutenir les femmes dans
work
les
and
milieux où elles
try
sont
to
déplacées,
support these
maltraitées,
women
victimes de
who
violences ou
have
autres.
been
C'est des piliers qu'on leur
displaced, who
offre le
have been
médical, le psychosocial,
badly
le
treated, who
socio-économique
have
et le
been
légal.
raped,
Donc, voilà.
etc.
C'est merveilleux ça.
And so
Merci,
there's
Annie.
work we can do, but
Donc, si on passe à la
it's
prochaine
hard.
question, on en a parlé un
So
petit
if
peu,
we
mais
go
on
to the
peut
next
juste revenir sur
question,
les principaux défis structurels et
is
systémiques
what are the
auxquels les
main
femmes réfugiées sont
structural
confrontées en
and
matière de
systemic
santé et
challenges that
comment les
refugee
politiques
women are
internationales peuvent
confronted with in health
mieux répondre
matters?
aux besoins.
And how can international policies be reconsidered to better respond to these
Dans son
needs?
texte, dans sa recherche sur apartheid médical,
And so if we're
il a
talking about
utilisé la
medical
philosophie,
apartheid,
c'est, ben, on fait affaire avec l'apartheid, on déconstruit l'apartheid, on élimine l'apartheid. Puis là, ça y est, ça c'est la réponse.
the first response is, well, we just need to get rid of the apartheid situation and everything will be fine.
Au début, j'ai vraiment envie de vous présenter juste
And that
les
becomes
défis
the only
auxquels font face,
response.
en général,
And
la
I
population
just wanted to
palestinienne,
talk
puis
about
ensuite juste
the
ressortir
challenges
ceux
that
auxquels font face les femmes qui sont
Palestinian
atteintes de
women
cancers plus particulièrement, parce que la mise en
experience in
contexte est
general.
hyper importante. Okay? Mais je vais passer à travers ça rapidement. Puis,
But I'll
je vais
just put it in context very quickly.
Tu m'as envoyé?
non,
Um,
ça va, je vais lire. Oui, oui. Oui,
Est-ce que
ça
je peux le
I'm just
partager?
going to read
Oui, oui,
something.
absolument. C'est le diapo numéro 3, si tu veux. Ça va être plus simple.
So it's slide number 3.
Cathy, je vais
If you have.
partager comme ça que tu vas voir aussi
So we will all have the slide to look at.
Cathy m'a mis la main, c'est correct?
Sans mes notes, par exemple. Les notes sont imprimées un peu de-
Okay, so the slide says anatomy of a genocide.
Un diapo magnifique parce que c'est le rapport de Francesca Albanese, qui est rapporteur spécial des Nations Unies pour les territoires occupés, qui d'ailleurs pour
And so this is a quote from the special reporter to the UN for the occupied Palestinian territories. So we're looking at slide number 3.
C'est celui qui est tout des blocs rouges. Oui, celui-ci.
Yeah, with the
Alors, vous
red
le voyez
blocks.
ici, on a
Okay.
la colonisation, des maisons de cuite, malnutrition,
So you see in the upper
fermeture en
left-hand
gros,
corner,
fermeture arrêtée,
colonization,
terreur psychologique,
440. Oh, it's going very fast.
détention.
Need to go back to the last one.
Je vais continuer.
There we go.
Détention, couvre-feu, assassinat.
And so colonization results in houses being destroyed, curfews, assassinations, torture, being not having the right to travel. And this is the, in quotes, the normal situation. And so if we look at what's happening to women specifically,
que 60% des
there's
cancers
so
sont dus à un stade
little
avancé.
diagnosing of breast cancer going on
L'autre,
is
c'est il n'y a pas
that
de chimiothérapie ou
2/3 of the
radiothérapie
time it's
lors
being
donc il faut
diagnosed
qu'elle quitte
too
ailleurs.
late to be able
Et
to be
je reviens au
treated.
système de permis parce que j'en parle aussi. Israël peut
And
être
there's
un référent
also
parce
the
qu'Israël aussi a un
refusal
des meilleurs
to
systèmes de santé
grant
dans le monde.
permits.
Donc, ils ont
Israel
des
has one of
moyens.
the best
Mais
health
ils émettent pas des
systems
permis
in the
comme
world,
ici. Les émettent, c'est
but
à
they
compte-gouttes.
don't
Alors, on a eu
give
des pourcentages de nombre de
permits
permis qu'ils émettent,
to
puis avec les années, les
Palestinians.
permis diminuent d'année à année. Comme je vous ai dit, ils émettent des permis
And
à la
there are
personne.
fewer,
Donc,
or rather,
Amira
there are
peut partir
fewer and
toute seule.
fewer
Alors,
permits being
imaginez si vous
given
voulez
every
envoyer votre
year to
enfant, une femme qui va y
Palestinians.
aller toute seule, par exemple, pour recevoir ses
So
traitements. Quand on parle de cancer
if
de
you
sein, moi, j'ai un
want
compagnon, mon père a ses
to
traitements,
send
mais
your
avec son permis, je peux
child
poser toute
to
seule. Mais
get
bon,
treated for an illness,
absence, pénurie
or
des
if
médicaments,
you
interdiction
want
des
to be
traitements du
treated
cancer à
yourself
Gaza,
for an
Israël
illness, it's
interdit les
harder
traitements
to
du cancer
get
de rentrer à
permission
Gaza.
to travel to these
Et ça,
hospitals.
depuis 17 ans que
There's
c'est
a
encore plus
lack
illégal
of
d'imposer.
medication
Absence de
in
soins de
Gaza.
base pour les femmes. Donc, si tu reçois
There
un
are no cancer
diagnostic,
treatments
en
that are
partant,
occurring right now in
tu
Gaza. They're
n'attends comme genre,
forbidden.
il n'y a pas des soins qui sont disponibles
There are
pour te soigner. Fait que tu peux bien recevoir ce
there's no
diagnostic si tu es
basic health
chanceuse, mais
care
cela ne
for
signifie pas
women.
que forcément tu vas obtenir les soins qui vont avec. Hôpitaux et médecins ciblés, on l'a vu,
And
les hôpitaux et les
hospitals
médecins ont
and
toujours été des cibles,
doctors
même les
are being
hôpitaux ont été
targeted
désignés comme des
by
espaces safe spaces par les
bombs,
Nations
as
Unies.
we've
Et
seen
sous la loi
already. They're
internationale,
not
ils sont pas
safe
censés être
spaces.
ciblés. Ils ont
Under
été ciblés. Il
international
y a plus de
law,
500 médecins qui ont
hospitals are
été
not
tués.
meant
Il y a plus
to
que
be
150 médecins qui ont
targeted, but
été
they are
emprisonnés, je
absolutely
pense, depuis
being
cette dernière année.
targeted.
D'accord? Alors, en
And just in the
partant,
last
évidemment, il n'y a
year,
pas 10 000 médecins à Gaza, mais il y a
doctors
aussi
have
2 millions de
been
personnes. C'est toute la population qui
imprisoned.
sont des médecins. Fait qu'on est en train de réduire, d'attaquer des attaques ciblées sur le personnel
So
médical. Et
there
d'ailleurs,
are
il y a
attacks that are happening on
aussi
medical
tout un groupe qui s'est
personnel.
organisé, Santé pour la Palestine, qui est construit des
So
travailleurs et
Health
travailleuses de
for
la santé
Palestine,
pour
which is
soutenir les
made
travailleurs de
up
la santé
of
en
healthcare
Palestine. Les politiques
workers,
publiques, comme je parlais
is
tantôt, ce
trying
sont des
to
politiques publiques qui sont conçues pour
provide
redévelopper le
care,
système, donc pour ne pas permettre le système à s'avancer
but
et de recevoir des équipements. Ça rentre
the
dans le monde
the
des
healthcare
médicaments
system
et
there
manque de
has been really
flexibilisation. Donc, si
deprived of
jamais, par hasard, on a un
resources.
hôpital qui est fonctionnel, qui a un
And
équipement, par
even
exemple,
if you
qui peut
have
servir, il y a
the
moins de
chance
courants
to
dans la
have a
vente.
functional
Donc,
hospital,
si jamais
there
tu
are
as,
often
je sais pas, un rendez-vous qui tombe pendant ces 48
there are
heures, bien,
often
tant pis,
power
tu vas pas
outages.
recevoir ton
So if
traitement.
you don't
Donc, ça,
have
c'est les éléments qui
electricity,
touchent
it's
particulièrement
you
les femmes
can't
atteintes de cancer de sein. Puis, comme
provide
je vous l'ai dit,
a
l'accès
lot
aux
of
soins,
these
c'est
treatments
très, très,
either.
très, 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 très
So there's
précaire.
a lack
Si tu es
of
chanceuse
equipment
d'avoir un
as well.
diagnostic qui te
So
permet
if
de
you are
résoudre ton
lucky
problème,
enough
la dernière affaire,
to
c'est,
be
comment je fais pas exprès le
diagnosed
mot, c'est
with a health
mastectomie,
issue.
c'est ça? Alors, puisque c'est la
So if we
solution
talk
la
about
plus facile là-bas, même s'il n'y a pas un
if you
besoin,
have
à la
breast
majorité des
cancer, for
femmes qui
instance, a
reçoivent ce diagnostic,
mastectomy is
au lieu qu'on leur
the
dise on
easiest
va
treatment.
procéder à un traitement qui est ciblé, qui répond à ta situation, on va procéder à une mastectomie. Puis évidemment, comme c'est le cas,
And
on a parlé tantôt de la
clearly,
santé mentale, mais aussi c'est une façon de stigmatiser aussi les femmes. Parce que c'est tout un
it
parcours qui
becomes
se
a way
travaille,
to
puis il n'y a pas les moyens de
stigmatize
soutenir les femmes dans
women
ces
because they're
conditions
not
pour les
getting
permettre
a
de vivre avec
targeted
et pour
treatment.
sensibiliser aussi la
They're just
population.
getting a full mastectomy. And so this becomes another way to stigmatize women.
Marie, est-ce que tu voulais rajouter quelque chose?
Marie, did you want to add
Ton micro est
something?
fermé.
Your microphone is
Oh
off,
non.
Marie.
Oh non, Marie? Oui.
Pardon. OK.
Sorry about that. I was saying that Zaya's slide really shows everything that is the Palestinian population is experiencing right now. And we can have refugees who have been displaced all over the world. And the health needs for refugees, immigrants, depending on where in the world they're from. And as we've seen the last few days as well, it can be very difficult For instance, for Syrians, Ukrainians, Sudanese, they end up in catastrophic situations, and that will have an impact on their health. So we become more vulnerable to illnesses, especially to contagious illnesses, when we are being displaced. People who are being displaced are often coming from war-torn countries or countries where there are natural catastrophes occurring, where the economy is not in good shape. They might not have regular access to food, water, and so they have a lot of deficiencies, health deficiencies, health issues that can really affect their dignity as well. They might have burns, rashes. They may be pregnant against their will. And so if you're giving birth in a situation where you don't have access to a hospital, where you don't have access to proper care, and if we talk about healthcare for chronic illnesses, it also gets very difficult. We've already talked a great deal about mental health, anxiety, hopelessness. There are lots of different manifestations where anxiety and other mental health issues can become chronic illnesses in themselves as post-traumatic stress disorders. If we've lost our job, our home, we may be under a great deal of stress where we develop illnesses that are non-contagious, such as cancers. And if we need to move countries, that's a need that we can't put off. And so we can end up with illnesses like diabetes, cancer, that are also partially due to having to live sedentary lives where they don't, or displaced people haven't been able to move. And so they end up consuming substances that aren't good for them. They aren't in a place where they can exercise. But for chronic illnesses, we really need continuity of healthcare and to be able to see how the illness is evolving. But when it's a chronic illness with medical repercussions, we really need regular care. And if you're a refugee, you're probably not getting that regular care. It's difficult to know how to get regular food regularly, especially healthy food. We can't pay for a doctor's appointment. We can't pay for a taxi to take us to a doctor's appointment. So there's a lot of factors that affect the health of these people.
Oui, tout à fait.
Yes.
Résumer tout ça, donc c'est ça, il y a autant de
Just to resume,
dans le pays
there are
où
so
s'il y a des
many
conflits, s'il y a des
obstacles in
au Canada.
countries that are
Il y a
experiencing
différents pays où on
conflict,
essaie
and there are
d'envisager comment
issues
intervenir
once
en
these
Angleterre.
people
Il y a beaucoup de
arrive
politiques
in Canada or
envers
elsewhere in the
demandeurs
world.
d'asile qui sont un peu dans des
And women who are asylum
enjeux,
seekers
que ce soit au niveau médical, au niveau judiciaire, au
may
niveau de leur
have
statut.
medical needs. They may have legal needs that are not being met. They may not have status in their new country. They may be homeless as well, because it's forbidden to ask for asylum once you're in the country. There's a difference in how you're treated. And so the situation becomes much more complex. You need to be flexible, inclusive. We need to have care that is flexible, inclusive, that really responds to the needs of refugees and asylum seekers. I'll go on to the last question. Can you talk about any projects, anything that you're fighting for, any initiatives which have succeeded in including feminist or decolonial perspectives in health responses for women in conflict zones or who have been displaced due to climate? And what lessons can we take to better our future practices and to better our care, our own care practices? So, Alana, did you have any? Did you have anything to add?
Yeah. I think one of I don't have any specific projects in mind, but what among much of the work that I do is to try to increase or because one of the things, I mean, an additional layer to all of this is that, at least certainly in the context of climate change or climate displacement, and I can't imagine it's different in respect to wars, is that, we have a international or regional framework which is supposed to be responsive, at least on a broad level, but for a number of geopolitical and economic reasons, persons who are refugees often find themselves, I guess for want of a better word, shunned or marginalized in society. So that of itself creates an added layer of complexity. I think in many countries, migrants or forced migrants are often viewed as an issue or a way of destabilizing the country and so on. And certainly this has, at least, in the Caribbean region, this has led to other challenges, including not only for women, but also children in what we would call transnational organized crime. So they become, because they're in the margins of society, it's difficult to get housing, as I think Marie mentioned, things like basic immigration and so on. They become susceptible to trafficking processes and so on, and which further exacerbates health and basic integrity and human rights issues. So what two areas that I've been working in is in relation to climate justice, in trying to create more equity in situations based on human rights considerations, and this includes looking at or increasing the rights of women and girls in decision making and in considerations that decision makers make, but also in other areas which really and truly, not only women, but they're also more exposed. So this includes transnational organized crimes. And I think someone mentioned before, we have to see it holistically, and indeed, it is a holistic challenge, because it's almost like a set of dominoes. You move from one challenge, triggers another challenge, which uh you know, while while exacerbates the situation of persons who are forced because of conflicts or climate change, absolutely disproportionately impacts women, and I always add girls because of you know the cultural and other close associations. So that's these are the areas I'm working in with the hope that and I think one of the key aspects is increasing women's role in decision making. Actually, just today I was reading a post from the UN Secretary General who lamented that even you know even within the context of the current uh Summit of the Future and 79 General Assembly, the proportion of women present within these meetings is less than even 40%, and despite the fact we know the importance and the important contributions that women can make in many of these decision making areas, there still remains you know enormous gaps, and to me that this is an area which is it can address part of or is part of the, I don't want to say solution, but can lead to the construction of some of these inequities we face that ultimately impact women's health and on other rights issues.
Merci, Alana. Donc,
Thank you,
elle n'a pas
Elena.
d'exemple particulier de projet ou de revendication,
So
mais
she's
plutôt,
just
elle, son
translating,
travail,
Amira's
c'est par
just
rapport au changement
translating what
climatique et au
Elena
déplacement.
said.
Et malgré qu'il y a un système normalement des décisions. Marie et Zahia, pour finir.
Marie or Zaya, did you have anything to add?
Petit disclaimer avant que je dise ce que j'ai à dire.
I'll just say a little disclaimer before I say what I want to say, because in Palestine, we have colonization and colonization, so that there's also a lot of non-governmental organizations that are working in Palestine, but we don't have any infrastructure that belongs to us. We don't have any control, and so we need to accept the presence of these NGOs.
Il faut qu'on atteste qu'on ne peut jamais mentionner le mot Nakba, qui signifie la catastrophe de 1948.
And so you end up with rules that you can't talk about. You can't mention the word Nakba, which is the catastrophe, the displacement of Palestinians in 1948. You can't go to protests. And there are many restrictions like this. And so in 2016, I had the experience that when I was working with Palestinian architects who know exactly what they're working with, and they know how to work with the bureaucracy, everything that's written in the contracts, with the money from the United Nations and other international organizations. They're aware of the procedures. And even despite that, with the paternalistic attitude of NGOs, they are still part of the solution. And so there's one organization called Medical Relief for Palestine that works with an NGO from the United Nations to provide care to women. And this is this is enormous for us. We really need to ensure that women can get this treatment in safe uh, in safe situations. And there were a lot of women who were undergoing tests who said, oh, if it's positive, I don't want to know. And currently, out of cancers that affect women, breast cancer is the cancer that is affecting the most women in Palestine.
Il en fait aussi à Nablus, il en fait évidemment à Ramallah, mais c'est plus central. Je veux dire, c'est une des campagnes qui a réussi, qui était très
And so they've worked, this NGO has worked on campaigns in Gaza, in Nablus, in Ramallah to reach out to women and convince them to undergo testing. And they've worked with different hospitals as well, Victoria Hospital. And so there are partnerships between hospitals and NGOs to work on raising awareness of different tests that need to be done and helping people get visas as well to visit these hospitals so that people can get treatment outside of Palestine.
Marie, est-ce que tu avais autre chose?
Marie, did you have anything to add? Maybe just two little things. Just building on what was mentioned by my colleagues, when you have a catastrophe in a country, medical professionals often arrive with their bags already packed, and that's colonization. We really need to ensure that we are listening to women who are being treated. What are their priorities? What are their priorities for being treated as well? Medical professionals are often going in with their own priorities and they're avoiding listening. They're not listening to the priorities of the women who they are treating. Because there are emergencies to be treated, but you can't keep people in an emergency situation. And we really need to work with national healthcare systems instead of in parallel with healthcare systems, like in Haiti, for instance. And we need to make sure that there is continuity of care as well, and ensure that we're paying attention to mental health issues as well. We need to ensure that people are getting first frontline healthcare services as well, not just emergency services. Sometimes it seems like people are just being asked to wait in parking lots to be seen by doctors, and that's colonialization. That's not treating people like they're humans. And so we always seem to find the money to carry out the projects that we've already decided on to deal with emergencies. But when people who have survived have have more care, suddenly the money has dried up. So we need to not continue that.
Merci. C'était la
Thank you
dernière
very
question.
much,
Est-ce que vous voulez
Marie.
rajouter un petit quelque chose avant qu'on passe à la période de questions?
Would you like to add anything else before we go on to the question period? I just wanted to mention that in individual interventions,
on n'a pas besoin d'être appelé par des organisations pour le faire, mais chacun peut apporter son grain de sel.
everyone can, we always need volunteers to help with displaced people. When I go to Lebanon, people are living in a catastrophic situation, but locals are still bringing water and food for young people. They're acting like humans, and so we need to treat them like humans. It's very, very important.
Merci beaucoup. Je comprends que
Thank you.
la réflexion, c'est un peu autour de créer peut-être un rapport de pouvoir
So
avec les institutions
we need to think
gouvernementales,
about
essayer de trouver une façon
how
de
we're building
réduire la bureaucratie ou de critiquer cette bureaucratie,
power
de pas juste
relationships
s'implimenter,
or
mais de trouver des
avoiding
alternatives,
hierarchical
des
relationships
camps, des
with
alternatives qui sont
people
proches à
who
nous,
need care.
qui sont pour, avec nous. Et
And
donc,
so
j'essaie de réfléchir à tout ça.
to
Merci
work
beaucoup pour vos
with
réflexions,
local
Amira,
populations. So
Marie
thank you very
et
much for your
Alana.
reflections,
Je pense que
Zaya,
maintenant,
Marie,
on
and
peut parler de
Alana.
questions et échanges.
So we're going to pass to the about 15 minutes of questions and answers.
Peut-être une qui vient pour Marie. Qui voulait savoir s'il y a des données au niveau des crimes de guerre.
So there's a question for Marie to ask about the statistics around war crimes that have been made public. I know that there are reports that have come out. The United Nations does its own reports. There are many different organizations that do reports. There are different countries that do report. There are some very recent reports that just came out of Palestinian prisoners and how they were being sexually assaulted and tortured by Israeli prison guards and soldiers. But there are very few statistics that are coming out of Palestine, unfortunately. Are there any other questions, reflections, comments?
Well, j'aimerais just remercier.
I'd just like to thank you all. It was really impressive to hear all of this information.
It's such a huge issue, a structural issue, and it's almost like when we talk, we live in a post-colonial world. When I think about all the violence against women, we have to also think of a post-patriarchal world, and it's hard to know where to start. But I heard some interviews with women who were living in refugee camps in Chad, and they were Sudanese women who were experiencing such violence. The worst example was a 14-year-old girl who had been raped by 3 men, and nothing was really done. She became pregnant, so she couldn't go back to school in the camp. But she said, I'm going to go back to school. I can't go for a year because I can't be in when I'm pregnant. There's such a stigma. And she also felt she was living in fear because these 3 men were still in the camp. So it's like where do you start when there's these kinds of horrible things that we all know exist? And you've shone the light on a lot of really important information, and I thank you very much. And I think the strategies are, feminism isn't new, and women have been fighting for a long time to deconstruct and to try and have responses to this violence. And I guess we just have to keep going, but it's a bit discouraging.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? So how can we really share the voices of the people who are suffering in these ways? It's not new. It hasn't started today. It hasn't started recently. How can we ensure that what's going on is brought to higher bodies, and that something really changes in this system? If you'll let me, my cynical side wants to say that the solutions are already there, but there's a lack of political will.
La pression qui était le résultat d'un travail acharné de la part des militants, des militantes.
All of the pressure that's being put on politicians right now from different workers, from different unions, even from some elected officials, are really trying to ensure that something can change, because it takes policy change to make change. Marie talked about arms, and how can we restrict the sale of arms of weapons to ensure that they aren't being used. If you think of the NRA in the United States, that's the largest lobby in the US, and that's the gun lobby. And what allows Israel to wage war on Palestine is the astronomical sums and the weapons that Israel receives, not only from the United States, but also from Canada. And there are weapons that are being made in Canada that are being used by Israel to attack Palestinians. F-35s are being made here in Canada that are being used in Gaza. And under international law, Canada can be considered to be participating in genocide. It's absolutely legitimate. And so Melanie Joly recently said that Canada had stopped supplying weapons directly to Israel. So now they're being sent to the United States, who then sends them directly to Israel. So the weapons are still being made in Canada, and they're being used in Gaza, and now they're being used in Lebanon as well. And Lebanon has many, not only Palestinian refugees, but also many Syrian refugees. All that to say, when we asked Melanie Joly what she was going to do about this, there has not been any concrete solution. She's just pulling the wool over our eyes to say that something has changed, but in reality, nothing has changed. So all the work that's being done by civil society in Quebec did something. It's a start, and we need to really continue. 40 years ago, when I arrived here, people didn't know where Gaza was. They didn't know about the situation with Israel and Palestine. And now people are aware, but we need a radical wake-up call. And I'm not saying this to give you flowers, but it's so precious that it's so wonderful that you're holding an event like this because we need to start somewhere. And little by little, we are going to make change.
Un autre ajout, un autre commentaire?
Is there another comment?
Moi, je dirais quelque chose, peut-être juste, je pense que c'est
I'd
juste
say
pour,
something.
la réflexion que sont toutes les mêmes luttes quand même. Parce que les luttes,
These are all the same fights for against climate change, against war, against the secondary effects of war, against cancer, against cardiovascular diseases, babies with low birth weight. Women and young children are really bearing the brunt of all of this. And in the face of climate change, and there are sociological studies as well that say that these women have less access to property, less access to money over the course of their years of their lives. It's hard to know where to start, but I think we need to remember that it's all the same struggle. It's all the same struggle for the rights of women, for the rights of children as well, for Indigenous people. But we need to remember that these aren't separate struggles. We need to all work together. Thank you for saying that, because that's really something I wanted to mention. It's so easy to put issues in, to work on different struggles in silos, but it's so important to come together, to find people in parallel struggles and work together, because these are not issues that only affect one part of the population. And so we need to work on building relationships between different fights, between different struggles, and so that we can come together and make change. Was there a final question or comment before we end for today? One last thing. What, talking about our common struggles? You saw the student encampments. I just want to underline that FRAPRU, which is a housing rights coalition here in Quebec, had a camp in Quebec City 2 weekends ago. And so that really shows that our struggles really have a lot in common. So the last word goes to solidarity. So thank you so much to all of you for being here today. I know that there's a few people in the webinar as well, webinar. So thank you, Alana. Thank you, Zaya. Thank you, Marie, from the bottom of our hearts. We will be putting an article, a conclusion to the discussion on the ACS, the BCAQ website. But thank you to all of you for your presence today. And so there's for people who are here in person, there is a buffet.
Merci de votre invitation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Merci de nous avoir invités à cette rencontre. Bonne continuation.
Thanks for inviting us to this meeting, and have a good continue your work well.
Alana écrit merci de m'avoir invité. J'ai vraiment apprécié la conversation et solidarité. Merci beaucoup. À tantôt.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take
Thank you,
care.
Alana.